Thanks a million, Judy. So I'm Niamh Hickey and I work in the University of Limerick. So I'm an assistant professor in education with mentoring, though that's a very new appointment. So I'm still kind of getting used to introducing myself that way, but I'm very excited about it. And I've had the privilege of following along with some of Robert's recent journey as well. As we're both in the same university at the moment. And Robert, thank you so much for joining us here today because you have so much to share for a group like this, and we're all just really looking forward to hearing from you. So thank you so much. Niamh Lafferty as well, our other colleague in the University of Limerick, is here but is having a little bit of difficulty with the camera and mic as well. But she's a lecturer in educational leadership. At the university and also works very closely with Robert. So Niamh would love to give an introduction as well. So I hope it's okay, Niamh, to do it on your behalf there. And I'll pass over to Marie.
Hi, thank you very much for that, Neve. So just across the water and further north in the UK, I work at the University of Dundee. I'm a senior lecturer in educational leadership in the Division of Education and Society up there. I'm very much looking forward to listening to Robert's journey and his presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, Niamh, and Niamh also. So thank you again, everyone, for coming to our session. So I'm going to introduce Robert. He's an experienced teacher who has worked in school leadership roles in Qatar and London. He has a master's in educational leadership from the University of Limerick, where he's currently positioned as a PhD candidate. He's a research supervisor for educational leadership master's students and has published on the topic of promotional practices in schools. And so Robert's going to talk to you today about his research and his experience in the relationship between research and practice. So Robert, if you'd like to take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Judy, and to everybody else for coming along. Obviously, it's an amazing privilege to be even asked to do this. So I've been really excited about it. So without further ado, I'll just start clicking through these slides here. Just in terms of giving a bit of background information about myself and my journey and how I've ended up where I am. In 2016, I graduated with a second-class honours in BTech education from the University of Limerick, specifically looking at design and technology and architectural technology. The reason I've put my grade in there, the second-class honours, I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. I holidayed for a weekend in London one weekend while I was a university student, fell in love with the place and decided to move to the United Kingdom. And that's when my teaching journey really began. I was actually quite unsure whether or not I wanted to be a teacher, even during my undergraduate degree. But the minute I stepped foot into a classroom, I just absolutely fell in love with it. I fell in love with the practice of it. And as I started to look at leadership positions, that just fascinated me even more. So following on from that, I was promoted to head of year 10 in my second year of teaching. I was 23 maybe at the time. It was a really young sort of appointment, and I was promoted above a lot more experienced people. Again, that is something that I will discuss a bit further on. But that kind of led to me thinking about leadership and the appointments of leadership at quite an early age. It brought about some sort of conflict in personal relationships, and that's kind of what I went on to kind of hold on to when I started researching at a later date. I stayed in that school 3 years, absolutely loved it. However, a colleague of mine, an ex-colleague, had contacted me. She was teaching in a school out in Doha in Qatar, and asked, did I want to come over and set up a department in design and technology? So in 2019, I moved to Qatar, didn't know a whole pile about the country. I knew they had a World Cup. I didn't know what currency they used. It was kind of on a whim, and I've absolutely loved it. I've been here 5 years now in total. So in 2020, I was promoted to head of faculty. So a step up beyond head of department for design and technology, where I oversaw, I think, 7 subjects. I was in charge of the exams and the progress of the student scores. And that was a real learning curve in terms of getting involved in a higher stage of middle leadership, whereby I needed to have a bit more understanding of other subjects. And it kind of stood me in good stead moving forward as to what I wanted to do with my own ambitions. During that, I started my master's during COVID-19 in 2020 and graduated with a first-class honours. I said I'd return to the reason I was including my own grades, and I was a bit disgusted at myself with my second-class honours. So the reason I started doing the Masters was I wanted, one, to prove to myself that I could really push on and get a first-class honours. Obviously, COVID, I'd just ample amount of time inside there, so I felt really comfortable with the amount of time I had to be able to approach it. And then I just really wanted to bring on my own knowledge and my own expertise. I was leading for quite a number of years, faculties, departments, head of years, and I just wanted a grounding in terms of I have an understanding as to what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, as opposed to it just being a learned trait. I was fortunate enough that Dr. Niamh Lafferty contacted me and offered me to publish my research following on from my master's thesis. That happened and was finally published in 2023 after an extensive amount of work with Patricia Mannix-McNamara and Niamh. And I just felt so fortunate that they were considering my work to be of a standard that it could be published. Niamh again contacted me. She's looked after me so well and asked would I be a master's thesis supervisor in 2023 in the University of Limerick. So I'm currently on my second year of that, working with another cohort of students, and it's just been fantastic for my own development in terms of like branching out. I started my PhD research in autumn of 2023 in the University of Limerick, and as recently as yesterday I finished up my role in Doha, and I'll be moving home to take on just a regular teaching role in Ireland, up in Dublin, and continue my research within the University of Limerick. So in terms of my research, initial research was inspired with a vast amount of conversations with Patricia and with Niamh. We were just in a chat room one night with the other master's students that were in my own cohort, and I just got to thinking why people were promoted and why other people weren't promoted. And through the conversations, what I was thinking about, is it an abuse of power to perhaps maybe plant a seed in somebody's head, just a quiet conversation, maybe asking them, you know, I think you'd be good at this role. Have you ever considered it? And I just kind of wondered, was that favoritism? Was it bias? Was it an abuse of that power, that relationship dynamic that you have with regular teaching staff? Or is it simply just seeing something in somebody, and maybe that if they work hard enough at it, they would deserve that type of promotion? So there were so many ideas bounced around. We refined the ideas. I had an extensive amount of conversations with colleagues and ex-colleagues over Zoom and phone calls. And as we started to refine the idea and I started looking at initial research, there wasn't a vast amount of research involving around the topic of leadership, looking at teachers' point of views and middle leadership point of views. So I decided to maybe we'd have a look into that a bit more. And we started to look at teachers and middle leaders' perceptions of promotional practices within schools. Many believed that promotions were unfair and unjust, and I wondered, was there more to this than just simply feeling aggrieved at an appointment that you maybe have missed out on? Or you know, was it down to a number of different reasons? Obviously, having experience in certain areas or having academic qualifications. So we looked into that a bit more. In the end, the research was narrowed down, and as I said a couple of seconds ago, promotional practices and mentorship within schools from the perceptions of teachers and middle leaders was looked at. The research included looking at the following realm in the realm of promotions, stemming from the interviews. So we looked at pay as a factor in seeking promotions, ambition, experience as a factor in receiving promotions, base fitting or nepotism sometimes as we referred it to in receiving promotions, gender gaps in promotional practice decisions, and credentials and personalities. When looking at the mentorship side of things, then the following results were points of discussion stemming from the interviews with the interviewees that I had interviewed. 15 in total were involved, and the emerging themes that were coming out of that were characteristics of mentorship, experience of mentorship, opinions on mentorship, and formal versus informal mentorship. just looking at the whole realm of mentorship there, depending on who I was talking to and the context in which they were teaching, it varied quite often. Any teachers that I had spoken to within the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland had very little experiences of mentorship. Generally looking at the ITE, the initial teacher education programs, there was a small bit of mentorship that they maybe have taken out of that. And when there were early year teachers, generally in Ireland, they had looked at the DRIHIT. It was just the initial teacher mentorship program for a first year teacher. When I was comparing that to schools that were out in Doha, Qatar, and looking at schools that were out in the United Kingdom, where I had previously come from, the mentorship was incredibly different. The people that I spoke to from the Republic of Ireland often refer to it as like an egg crate culture, where teachers were just teaching in isolation and never really came into contact with one another. The doors were often closed. And when I compare that to the United Kingdom and, well, the schools that I spoke to in the United Kingdom and the teachers from those schools, and indeed Doha, it was a much more open door policy. Teachers would come in, they would observe, they might email ahead, they might not. There was learning walks going on to make sure that the learning that was occurring inside in the classrooms were up to standard. And it was just such a comparison in relation to what was going on in Ireland. And a lot of points come out of that. And I just found it fascinating. I've taken on a job recently in Ireland, and the principal has spoken to me about maybe generating that degree of mentorship inside there and bringing people along on some sort of a journey and promoting a more open door policy. So I just to compare and contrast maybe a British education system that we employ here in Qatar and indeed in the United Kingdom versus what was happening in Ireland. It just made me think about so much, and we'll get onto that again a bit later on. We looked at any issues arising from promotional practices as well, difficulties when being promoted. Again, if a number of colleagues that may have been close to one another were going for the same job, that provided quite a lot of conflict inside in a school. And schools are small places, they are insular. And it was fascinating to have those type of conversations with other teaching staff about how they felt about it. Again, that leads on nicely to maintaining relationships following promotions. I've had so many chats over the last number of weeks and years with other people, and a quote that actually stuck out to me about a person that was promoted to an assistant headship role here in Qatar was they were kind of trying to be friends with everybody. And somebody said to me that you can only run with the hounds or run with the hares. You had to pick one and had to decide that you can't have a foot in both camps. And not that I necessarily agree or disagree with that. I just found it fascinating in terms of the perceptions of other people. And then untenability, just people finding it really difficult to actually come into work and maybe looking to take some steps back. In a bit of research that I'm engaged with another student from last year's MESL, just looking at people wanting to take steps back from leadership positions. And I know now in the Republic of Ireland, if you were to take a step back from a principalship role, generally you go to the bottom of the ladder in terms of you're standing inside in the school. And if there's cuts or trims inside in the school, because of that, the ex-principal will be the first one to go. So I just found that absolutely fascinating, and that there's no dignified step down. And the more people I speak with and the more conversations I have, I just have found it so fascinating. Obviously, I spoke about some of the current research I'm engaged in with Gemma O'Byrne and Niamh Lafferty, and that has come on the back of my research. So I looked at it from a mostly predominantly secondary teacher point of view. And Gemma has then gone on and looked at it from an Irish perspective in primary schools. And while I had done qualitative, Gemma engaged in quant. And I just found that so fascinating to see the type of results that were coming out of it. And that paper is due to be published in the next few months. Personally, from my PhD point of view, I'm exploring through a systematic lit review the gaps and procedures of promotional practices within schools. Right now, that is looking from a worldwide point of view, as I continue to narrow it down to different areas. it just becomes ever more kind of interesting to me, and looking at it from a primary point of view and a post-primary point of view has been really interesting to me, because I've never really engaged in primary schools. After that, I'll be conducting questionnaires to see if what stems from the research aligns on a macro level within the Republic of Ireland. And then interviews will be conducted on a smaller scale with a number of teachers in the Irish context to get their opinions dependent on what emerges from the above research that I've spoken. So really enjoying that. It's been incredibly interesting. But yeah, in terms of my implication for my professional practices and kind of where I'm at now, I began to see everything in a whole new light. I think studying on the master's program has just been so beneficial for just not even to prove to myself that I could do it, but also everything that I learned. You often think that you're engaged in this type of research and maybe a lot of it is surface level, but I especially think when you get to the research point of views, that you can really delve into something that is meaningful to you and that you may have had experience in it, and it just broadens the horizon incredibly. I've absolutely loved every bit of it. I was promoted at a really young age. My leadership skills were a learned trait. I said that earlier through observation. And the school that I'd previously worked at in the United Kingdom, it was an incredibly excellent school to work at. They were TES School of the Year at one point while I was employed at the school. And the leadership structure inside there was really robust. It was pyramidal and it worked really, really well. But from the top down, it was hardcore, for want of a better word. It was just like everything was done at an incredible pace. Everything was done with such passion. We had excellent practitioners working inside in the school. But at points it could become very cutthroat. And I had to sit back at points and think, is this really what I want? And is this who I want to be? And it made me deeply think about my own practice. I became very reflective because of that. And then when I moved on to my new school, I saw a complete different side to how leadership should be done, leading by example, not necessarily leading through fear, and being able to compare and contrast them and thinking about, well, what type of teachers are happier in which school that I've worked in, and why do I think that, and how were the middle leaders treated, how were the senior leaders treated, how were the teachers treated. And I just became so inquisitive about it all, that it made me question every single decision that was made at leadership level from my own point of view, not literally going into the principal or deputy principal, but just really deeply thought about what was happening in schools, the implication of what was happening and what was being obviously pushed inside and on a school level. And it allowed me to think about if I ever wanted to progress my career further in terms of moving up to assistant headship or deputy headship or headship, would I ever actually really want to do the big job of head teacher or principal in an Irish school? How would I lead if I was to ever do that? And, you know, maybe I thought I love teaching so much that I'd want to be engaged in leadership at a lower level. And it also has obviously opened up so many doors for me through my conversations with Niamh Lafferty, Niamh Hickey, Patricia, in terms of maybe I might not necessarily stay engaged in secondary school education. Maybe I'll make a move to third level at some point. So it's completely changed everything for me and how I look at things and how I approach my day-to-day practice and how I lead. And obviously, as I was on my way out the door yesterday, the most satisfying kind of engagement that I had with a member of staff was bringing her through a leadership journey, taking her through her national professional qualification for middle leadership and seeing her blossom. And that was just really rewarding to me. And it's just about building that capacity for others. And that's all I'd ever want to be, no matter what kind of leadership level I engage with. So then this is my paper that I had published in 2023. I've left a QR code on the right-hand side. If anybody would like to snap that, it will take you straight to the picture. I've included my email address down there from the University of Limerick. And I also have included my X/Twitter handle. I'm not the best at it, but I do intend to be more engaging with it when I have a bit more free time over the summer. So I'll just leave that on this slide for a couple of minutes. And then just from my own point of view, thank you so much for coming and listening to me today. I hope I was relatively easy to understand. And I'd like to open up the floor now to any questions if anybody does have them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that. That was really, really interesting. I hope everyone enjoyed that presentation. It's so many things that you mentioned were really interesting, and actually towards the end, the point you made about that almost tension or grappling with that sense of, actually, if I love teaching so much, do I really want to elevate my position? Because actually it takes me away from teaching. And a friend of mine who I think he was a teaching assistant, so he wasn't necessarily a teacher, but he made an interesting point about where he said, isn't it interesting how in schools we take our best teachers and promote them to a point where they're not teaching anymore, and we take them out of the environment where they're serving in such a an important way. But it's just the way, it's an interesting thing to note, I think, and observe, and actually maybe go back to that point you mentioned around motivations or the ambition and the reasons why people seek promotion, and they differ so much, but actually it's also reasons why they seek promotion at certain levels. Some people might only want to get to a particular point, some may want to go to the absolute top of the hierarchy. So really fascinating. Thank you so much. I could talk about this for a while, but I'll open the floor for questions from the audience, and then we've got some questions from us as co-conveners. So would anyone like to dive in with a question first? And feel free to switch your camera on if you'd like to, or type in the chat if that's necessary. Go ahead, Frederica.
Hi. Thank you very much, Robert. I have a couple of one comment following what has been just said about why maybe some people don't engage in potential progression in their career because they would, be taken away from teaching. I think also there are, I don't know, socioeconomic situations where you think it might be a safer job if I stay in a lower, like middle kind of role, because you see, it's a matter of, this is a job that they need, where instead, especially with leadership and management, you might think managers are expendables in a way. You see my point? So depending on the structure of the institution, if they have to do cuts or how to save money, you can always make a manager redundant, where instead all of a sudden with teachers, you would end up being understaffed. So I think there is also the element of safety in the structure. And that's a comment. And the other is more like a question in terms of, have you noticed any elements of, I don't know, intersectionality in terms of how people perceive opportunities in progression, or their decision to not consider a career progression? So any correlation between the characteristic of the population and their decision or their exclusion?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, just on your first point as well, in terms of like the trim, I do think there's definitely a safety measure in place if you're a regular classroom teacher. Again, it's entirely dependent on the context in which you work. I know there's serious safety in the Republic of Ireland in terms of like the structures that are in place there, and that might be less so in other countries. But I always think that there is safety in the classroom, because generally you come into work, there's that bit less pressure on you to perform, in terms of actually you're not front and center in front of everybody else. I'd also like to make the comment that I think nobody necessarily gets into education or teaching to become a principal. That is something that kind of happens over time. You know, nobody goes to university to study to be a principal. So I find that really interesting, the motivations as people progress through their own career. In terms of correlations from socioeconomic backgrounds, we've not actually looked into that, but what we have looked into is reasons for people not getting involved in leadership. And the conversations that I've had specifically with Gemma O'Byrne, hers was quite a lot to do with that, especially at a primary level in the Republic of Ireland. People obviously like the safety. People don't want to upset other colleagues either, and they don't want to be seen to be maybe rocking the boat or going for a position that they think, well, they might be suited for, that maybe somebody who may be a small bit more feisty than them or more outspoken also wants to go for, and they just don't want to upset the apple cart in that regard. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one, especially in the Republic of Ireland in a primary school. Gemma's research kind of referenced the fact that a small rural primary school, for a lot of the time, the principal is a teaching principal. And because that they're a teaching principal, they have all the administrative duties to still carry out in addition to all of their teaching hours and class contact time. And that becomes incredibly disruptive to their own personal lives, and the stress levels then become incredible. And I spoke obviously about the undignified way to be able to step down if you're a primary school principal. And that might deter them from going up in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Federica.
Thank you. We've got another question from Habibat, and apologies for any mispronunciation of names. Habibat, are you able to turn your microphone on?
Yeah, okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's good to be here. It's my first time joining BELMAS online webinar, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak. Yeah, I also want to appreciate the presenter. The topic he presented is something that is pertinent to me, in the sense that in my own country, we have a peculiar case, in the sense that there are times that there are a lot of interplay in who becomes the leader in a school, especially when there are political interference in our public schools. It is the government who determines who becomes the head of the school, or who is being posted to a particular school or the other. And at times, it's even gets to the extent that those who are at the junior or a lower cadre, they make them the head of others who are in that school because of their affiliation to those in power and the likes. So as a result of that, the environment becomes very toxic, and even those that the head of school is meant to, govern and lead, they tend to have it very difficult, and the climate of that school is not a very welcoming one for the staff of the school and even the students that are in that school. And at the end of the day, it's going to definitely hinder the progress of the school, or even the results of the school in the long run is going to hinder that. And particularly the relationship between the workers in that school is going to be chaotic. It's going to be toxic. It's not going to be a very friendly one. And the moment you come into the school, you see the atmosphere that something is wrong here. And unfortunately, there is nothing that could be done about it, because it's like the head is being assigned to come there to rule them. So in my opinion, I think leadership of a school should be taught, even from the onset, should be taught. Like, if you want to become a head of a school, you need to maybe undergo certain training, because from the little experience I have, I could see that leadership is not a child's play. It's not a child's play. If you want to become a leader, there are a lot of things, like, because even you as a person, how is your emotional intelligence? How can you manage situations, especially when you are in the midst of of a chaotic situation. How do you manage such situation? But the situation where someone is just picked by somebody to come and lead in a school, then it becomes a problem. So that is just my suggestion, sorry, my observation about my own part of the world where I come from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Habitat. Just to add on to that, yeah, that my initial research kind of dealt with that nepotism and face fitting, and I just find it fascinating that even ourselves as people, you know, we generally tend to gravitate towards those who have similar interests in us, come from a similar background, and when that starts to happen in structural organizations such as schools or in private businesses, like I read Matthew Said's book and he talked massively about echo chambers, and you're just rehearing kind of what you want to hear because you're coming back from the same background and people have had the same shared experiences as you growing up. And he talks massively about the diversification of organizations and how it can only be good for a company. Obviously, the Euros are on at the minute, and Matthew Said was drafted in at one point to work with Gareth Southgate's England football team. And they hired a number of different people from a number of different sectors outside the footballing world. And the whole premise of it was that obviously Gareth Southgate is the football expert. He doesn't need to be surrounded by football experts. He needs people from several different walks of life, from different backgrounds, from different areas of the world, from different organizations and job types. Now, obviously, when you put that into school context, yes, we need people with backgrounds who are teachers in our leadership positions, but having a diversification of people that have come from a number of different universities, different backgrounds themselves, can only be good for an organization, I think. So when we kind of move away from that nepotism and face fitting side of things, I think we get a greater understanding of maybe the student population that we have in our school, maybe our staff. I work in an incredibly diverse type of school where students come from all over the world and staff come from all over the world. And if you look at the leadership structure inside the school, it's white British men, and that always struck me as something that was quite interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for your observation.
Thanks, Robert. I'm gonna and this, yeah, I think it's when you start taking that step back and noticing things like this, I think it's always really fascinating. I've got a question on behalf of Niamh Lafferty, but I'll just ask and then I'll hand over to Niamh Hickey or Marie for their questions too. So first is, how does your experience as a practitioner influence your research? And this question, it's actually quite useful to think about when you mentioned being really reflective, and you were saying that over time you were reflecting more and more and more. But actually, this time, rather than looking at how research influenced your practice, how would you say that being a practitioner and having that diverse experience that you've had, how has that influenced your research?
Yeah, I think you kind of walk a tightrope slightly. You've so many experiences on a day-to-day basis as a teacher that you could literally research into any number of them. And I think really thinking deeply about what is meaningful to you and perhaps what is going to be really emergent over the next couple of years in the educational landscape is massively important. And I just think that you try not to get bogged down so much in research, that when you're teaching and you're engaged in that classroom element of things, that you try not to think so deeply about everything, that you kind of need to take a step back and sometimes go back to basics and just be like, right, this is the task ahead of me. Try not to overthink it. You've got 24 students that have varying needs inside there. Try not to overanalyze everything. And I think I've become better at that over the last couple of years. But initially, when I started engaging in my research, I think everything became like I was thinking about everything probably too much, and being able to separate being a practitioner and being a researcher is incredibly important. Otherwise, you'll just be exhausted at the end of a teaching day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Marie?
Hi, yes, thanks. And mine links in, my question links in with that. I suppose I want to take it a little bit step a step further and think about the relationships that you have with your colleagues now that you are a researcher as well. You know, you talk about that curiosity about decisions being made, and you've just mentioned there about taking that step back as reflection, but colleagues obviously know that have done this research and are doing this research, and I just wondered, thinking about that relationship between researcher and practitioner, whether there's been any impact there, positives and or negatives.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, everybody is obviously quite aware that I am studying, and I try not to bring it up too often. But when you're engaged with the professional conversations by the water cooler, or you're passing somebody's classroom, it becomes quite interesting. I think for me, what has been the most rewarding aspect of it is since I've been following on from my master's research, a number of people have actually come up to me and said, "You've spoken so passionately about this. I want to now study a master's," and I think that's been really, really nice to do it. The other side of that as well is that people are always asking me, "Are you analyzing exactly what I'm speaking to you about?" And I have to take off my researcher hat in that regard and be like, "No, it's just a general point of conversation." So there's been pros and cons to it. People are massively interested in it, and people are always asking me kind of what I am working on right now. But I do find myself thinking massively deeply about the conversations that we have, and they do lead to a number of discussion points. And I think just being more informed about that and the underlying reasons as to why certain things are happening is incredibly fascinating to me, and people generally tend to enjoy those conversations. So I think as time has gone on, instead of me approaching people, I've let people approach me if they're looking to have those conversations. It's just more organic.
Thank you for that, Robert, and thank you for your talk. You used fascinating a couple of times in that talk, and I have to say the whole thing was fascinating, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Neve, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. If I could just pop in, Robert, I think it was a really, really interesting talk in lots of different levels. Like, I mean, some of the pieces that, if I could just take the opportunity to highlight some of the pieces that resonated with me, like your conversation about the start of the research journey and the almost, if I could call them like scoping conversations that you're having. I think highlighting that piece of the research journey is such an important thing that we often overlook. You know, and it's something that when you're in the researcher practitioner space, it's obviously, you know, a little bit more accessible. But I think it's something that's really important that we're doing across the field, that we're taking the time to really just see what's going on in the ground and having these in-depth conversations with people about, you know, how our research is going to fit in with what's really happening in the ground and what's really going to be helpful now. Like, I think your passion for like building capacity of those around you is nothing short of admirable. And that comes through really clearly, you know, in every conversation I've had with you. And I think that piece around the flexibility or the lack thereof in terms of principals stepping down out of the role is a really important point that you've raised as well. I suppose something that it's a broad question really, but and it's kind of connected to what you've already said, but I experience you, Robert, to be a very reflective person. And I'm just curious about how you see reflective practice as fitting into this researcher, practitioner, all of these different roles, you know, teaching roles, leadership roles, and the kind of combination of all of the above. And what does like productive reflective practice look like? Because I know you've mentioned pieces around maybe, you know, thinking a lot about things in the moment and saying, okay, I need to compartmentalize and that sort of stuff. So I'm just really curious about how you see that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I reflect in a couple of different ways. I keep a diary kind of things that maybe I want to think more deeply about later on. And we'll really go through that extensively. I set kind of 30 minutes aside every day for that, and think about maybe how the day has panned out. This doesn't necessarily happen every day, but it happens at least once or twice a week. And just being able to kind of sort through your thoughts and break down the day and kind of think about how things have gone and could they have gone another way, I think is really, really important to me. I think the way I am most reflective is I have two very trusted colleagues that I hold dear to myself over here in Qatar, and they're both at a middle leadership level as well, like myself, and they're actually both leaving the country now as well. But for the 5 years that we've worked together, the conversations that we've had, and it might just be in passing, it might be a sit down and have a coffee inside in one of the classrooms or an office, is just incredibly important to me in terms of like getting somebody else's perspective, but not allowing it to also influence you. And I think that the two people that I go to the most, they're quite good at listening. And obviously, educational leadership coaching has come in and is quite extensive at the minute in terms of like the spotlight on it in terms of research. And a lot of that is just reflecting questions back at another person and having them being able to solve their own problems or think deeply about it. And I think the two colleagues that I hold dear personally for me have been quite good at that. And I would like to think in my own way that I've been able to repay them in that kind of reflective practice when they need to do it. And I think having colleagues that you can trust and that you know it won't go anywhere and that the conversations are just between you two or you three has been incredibly beneficial to allow you to kind of think about what has happened and break down the day or any sort of problem.
Thank you, Robert. That's fabulous. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of those professional conversations and those even professional networks that we can involve ourselves in as well. Stephanie, just before I pass over to you, I just also want to say in the chat, I did paste in, Robert, your email and your X handle and also a link to the paper as well, just in case anyone didn't get the chance to do that when it was on the slide. It is in the chat there as well. So Stephanie.
Hi. I think really, I just wanted to share what I'm finding difficult being a practitioner researcher, and whether you find the same thing difficult, if anybody's got any comments. So I'm finding that it's very hard for me to be theoretical enough for the PhD. And then my colleagues at a practitioner level want something much more practical that they can actually take away and use. And I find it really hard to get that balance in terms of getting something useful for colleagues to use, which therefore means they want to contribute more, and actually being theoretical enough to achieve the PhD.
Yeah, I agree with you. I often find that there is a divergence between the two. Obviously, mine is engaged at like a leadership level, so in theory based in that regard. But I've had friends of mine who've been engaged in research straight out of university, and some of you might feel the same way. So they've gone from undergraduate degree straight, teaching undergraduate degree straight into a PhD level. And from my conversations with them now, 10 years on, they always come back to the same thing, that they wish they had had feet on the ground in terms of having that experience. So that way they kind of thought that it would inform their research a small bit more. I often think, as you said, the divergence between the two is quite difficult. It's all well and good having this bank of research from my own personal point of view, but then you're also dealing with real human beings when it comes to leadership and telling people what to do or leading people or managing up as well as managing down. I think it becomes incredibly complex from my point of view. The theory doesn't necessarily always have the answer when you're dealing with people, and dependent on what type of research you're engaged with, Stephanie, I'm sure that might have that sort of divergence as well, as you just said. I don't know if that's been any helpful to you, but I feel the same way about the two sometimes. Yeah.
No, I think it's just reassuring to know that somebody else feels the same way.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and actually, if I may share as well, right, because I only recently completed my doctorate a few months ago, and actually delivered a talk to colleagues where, even though it was based on my research, I had to package it in such a way that there were practical takeaways for colleagues. And you do often find that you've got to make adjustments in what you're saying. You're not taking anything away from the content or the substance of what you're saying, but it's adapting to the audience that you're speaking to. If it was purely an academic discussion, then it might be more theoretical in nature, but actually getting feedback from the people who wanted some takeaways to sort of apply to their practice. It wouldn't have been helpful for me to have labored points around theoretical frameworks and all the rest of it, but then in writing, it needs to be more grounded in theory if it's an academic audience looking at that piece of work. So I think it's that sort of doing that mental calculation of, okay, what do I want people to take from what I'm saying or writing or communicating to them, and then making the adjustments accordingly. But it's tricky. It's tricky. I think I like Robert's analogy of a tightrope walk. It feels like that sometimes. Marie, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just quickly come in there and say, I think there's a similar situation when working with students, work with students at master's level and doctoral level, and the same is there, you kind of disseminating information, you facilitating their learning, but ultimately at the end of it, they want those practical aspects to take away and, that they can then use within their own practice. So again, similar sort of situation there. So I just want to add to that pile that you're not alone.
Thanks, Marie. Frederica?
Yes, I just wanted to say something linked to all this. I don't know if you either with PhD students, but also with practitioner. One thing that I notice is that for the nature of how they are required to perform, they tend to ask you for answers, like how do I do this? I have to do this. Give me the handbook so I can do it. I think I don't have any answers. Usually it's like education is a sector that opens up for questions. It doesn't give you answers. You're in the wrong, subject. One thing that I struggled when I was a PhD student because I had that problem. Like, okay, now I need to narrow down because I have to deliver. I don't know if it works for you, but I remember that using like a bit of autoethnographic approach, meaning I'm gonna give you my positionality as a theorist, as a scholar. So I'm gonna answer about what is the nature of the subject for me, what is the purpose of how I do my things methodologically. So I position myself, but I'm a human being with a theoretical position. It doesn't mean that I'm the perfect person and the only position available, but I usually say, I can tell you which question to ask yourself, and then you give your answer. I think it calms the PhD students a little bit, and sometimes it gives agency to practitioners, like, okay, I can give my own answers. Good to know. So I think it's the best way, in my experience, is I'll give you the questions because these questions are good, but then the answer is gonna be yours. Don't know if you had this experience.
Yeah, Robert, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, especially in relation to either supporting master students and or the way you've described earlier, supporting colleagues in that capacity building.
Yeah, what I found was in the 2 years that I've been supervising, and it kind of struck me as odd, and maybe I was this way as well when I was engaged in my master's research with Niamh Lafferty as my supervisor. The students kind of want to be hand-fed everything. And I found that to be incredibly frustrating. And even we met as a team of supervisors this year, and we agreed that we weren't going to spoon feed them, that they're engaged at a very high level of academia now as master's students, and that they need to go and figure out these problems for themselves. And especially at a level where all of these people are already educationalists anyway. I found that to be incredibly frustrating because I thought that you wouldn't necessarily want your students to be spoon-fed in a secondary school or a primary school classroom. So surely when you get to a master's level research that you're able to kind of go out there and find the answers yourself, and I can give you some really strong feedback as opposed to maybe correcting a few spellings or telling you need to reference something, that you engage with it at a more deeper level.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, similarly, when you've supported colleagues, have they come to you knowing that you've got a research background and sort of saying, Robert, tell me the answers. How does this work? You tell me how it works, or has it been more of a dialogue? How has How has that
Yeah,
played
it's
out?
definitely been more of a dialogue. I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, we're dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, colleagues that you have to see today and the next day and the day after that, and perhaps for the rest of your career. So dependent on what the actual problem is, you've got to be very mindful of the issues that you're dealing with and the answers that you're given. I've found that maybe directing them towards a piece of research is probably often the better way, and giving them the tools to be able to figure out the problems for themselves. Again, it depends entirely on what the issue is. I'll always try and give somebody a positive answer, dependent on what the problem is, but it can be difficult to, based on what it is. To be honest, it's not a one size fit all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's useful to have that balance where Frederica mentioned saying, well, my positionality is such, but it's just that, it's my positionality. It's not the way this should be done or the way you must think about it. It's, this is, I'm presenting one particular perspective, but there are, the other person who's asking the question should form their own, perspective and begin to frame that themselves.
It's contextual, isn't it? Sorry, Niamh.
No, sorry, Robert.
No, I just think it's a contextual thing. Like you can't give everybody the same answer for everything. And again, going back to the situation of the fact that you're dealing with real life human beings here, everybody's going to form their opinion. Even if you give 10 people the exact same answer, they're going to leave with a different answer. So it's interesting. Sorry, Niamh.
Yeah, no, I mean, in a very similar vein, I think I was just going to say, I think the crux of the matter is that there isn't one answer that we're going to find in education. So I think when we're talking about theory and practice coming together, we're really, like in how I see it, drawing on theory to inform our practice in terms of just a sense-making activity, and finding those different ways and different angles and different viewpoints that we can explore these pieces from, in order to just to grow and to move forward in different ways. So I think they mightn't necessarily, of course, even Judy, as you were saying, depending on even the audience that you're talking to, you're going to tailor what you're looking at. But broadly, I think as much as we're possible, we're trying to pull them together to explore new ways of looking at these pieces is how I view it. But for sure, as you say, Robert, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, and added to Habibat's earlier point about the wider contextual influences on practice, because of the fact that all her description of how the government is involved in her setting, the government is involved in leadership appointments, that can be a completely different experience to places where the government doesn't get involved in appointments, but it happens more amidst governing boards or trustees or whatever structure is managing the education system in that locality. That in itself will have its own knock-on effects, I think, to the on the ground practice, and then similarly might have its own impact on the interpretation and application of theory. We can have theory in here, which we have theory that we talk about, but sometimes the interpretation of it is so heavily dependent on the setting and the context, or how easy or difficult it is to sort of think about how it works in a particular setting is so I think contextualization is really, really key. Yeah, okay, well, any final questions, because we're running out of time now. Any final questions or comments from anybody else? So I'm going to close on one final question, which came from Niamh, which is, what would be your greatest piece of advice for emergent researchers, Robert?
I just think once you find something you're passionate about, then you can really dive into it. I think if you're going down a route that you've no real interest in, or you've no experience in on the ground level, I think it can be incredibly difficult to really get engaged in that. So I think once you find something that you are passionate about, and you really can see yourself doing it, because you will spend a lot of time at the computer, a lot of time reading, a lot of time writing, that it doesn't necessarily feel like a chore. I also would strongly suggest that you structure your time in such a way that you are making time to do it, because it might not always be the most fun things to sit down and do, but once you get engaged with it, it just kind of, it seems to flow effortlessly. And so I would say passion and structure massive.
So a huge thank you again to you, Robert, from all of us co-conveners, and of course I'm sure the audience is happy for me to extend thanks again for your fantastic presentation today, and also the answers that you've given to the questions. Thank you to all the participants for your contribution to our discussion. That also helps to make these events, you know, so much more lively, and it's really nice to interact with people. For those who are going to the BELMAS conference next week, all 4 of us will be around. We're happy to have informal conversations. We won't be having a set slot in the RIG session, so we will be around at various points throughout the conference. So please do feel free to come over, say hello, and have a chat. But if not, do look out for our next event later this year. Thanks again, and hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
everyone.
much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.